On November the 10th, 2010, students across the country converged upon London to protest a rise in tuition fees. Not since anti-war activists rocked Europe in the late 60s have students united against the government on such a massive scale.
1968 was a very, very remarkable year for students. It wasn't actually at its biggest in Britain. In Britain, there were only a small number of occupations.
Central London has been the site of many a protest over the years, but has also seen some of the worst cases of police brutality and the ruthless suppression of democratic freedoms by the state. In 2010, student demonstrators would brave the same threat at Millbank and Parliament Square.
But as a small minority of protesters turned violent, it became clear they had seriously underestimated the potential for trouble. Officers were overrun by those trying to get into Millbank Tower.
It's no good to say this was just a very small minority. It wasn't. There were quite a number of people who clearly were there wanting to pursue violence and to destroy property.
Actually, there's been very little violence. It's been enormously exaggerated by the press. On the demonstrations that have taken place, there were tens of thousands of students present. A very small number, less than 50, took part in what turned out to be a fairly heavy demonstration at the Conservative Party central office.
People don't just go out and protest for the sake of it because they've got nothing else to do, but because they're angry, because they want to get their point across.
I don't believe that students were out there in order to cause violence on the protests. They were out there to defend education.
When you look at the violence, I think you should not look at the violence of students, but look at the violence of this government and the police against the people who have legitimate concerns that what they voted for is not what they're getting.
There are demonstrations by young people who are very angry at not only the prospect of many universities having courses cut and therefore they're going to get less good quality teaching, but they're also very angry for the next generation of students who've already seen their educational maintenance allowance cut, which is the payment that's paid to students in college before they go on to university in order to keep them in college. And then they've seen this huge increase in the student fee up to £9,000 per year. So I've got a lot of admiration for the students for speaking up for the right to education, but also speaking up for the next generation.
At what point, when you keep getting pushed back, you keep trying to say what you want, what you feel, and you keep getting pushed back and told no, no matter how many of you there are on the streets, no matter how many of you vote, however you exercise your democracy, and you keep getting ignored, what do you expect people to do?
As well as having to contend with the police, students found themselves on the receiving end of some unexplained hostility from certain elements of the British media.
On the first demonstration at November the 10th, when we were at Millbank, we were sort of dancing around, there was music playing, and there were some people inside the building. There was also another building next to us that had massive TV screens, and we were watching the coverage of the demonstrations on the television at the same time, and it was really surreal. I mean, what we saw on the TV did not at all reflect what was going on in the demonstration.
The way Sky and certain right-wing media frame the debate is horrible because they're pushing a political agenda that ultimately favours big business, that favours no controls on markets, and that looks to further the wealth of a group of people that are already incredibly wealthy. So Sky News, I just ignore it.
Solidarity forever!
Well, the media coverage was incredibly sensational, and the National Union of Students adopted a very cautious approach to the whole thing. Many other students were much more assertive, and local student unions far more assertive, but the media played up the allegations of violence.
It's been a day and night of protest and confrontation as thousands of protesters clashed with police officers, while inside the House of Commons the government won the day on tuition fees. And tonight, even the car carrying Prince Charles and Camilla was attacked by demonstrators.
I don't think the mainstream media was entirely fair on the student protests. I think that there was an attempt to portray the students as violent and therefore divert the entire debate, shift the entire debate onto, you know, aren't these students violent? Look at these protesters. You know, look at the way that protest is evolving in our society.
The BBC as well has been, in some cases, has not reported on this fairly at all. I think particularly the interview with Jodie McIntyre, which was shown on BBC News, was deeply disturbing.
Will you shout anything provocative or throw anything that would have induced the police to do that to you?
Do you really think a person with cerebral palsy in a wheelchair can pose a threat to a police officer who is armed with weapons?
And I think the media have been consistently provocative and biased in their coverage. And I don't think it's true that society automatically believes what the media say. I think that we actually gained a lot of support from society. I received thousands, I mean literally thousands of emails, Facebook messages, handwritten letters from people saying how brave and inspiring the students have been. Despite
the media's attempts to try and divert attention away from the real issue, I think most of the population, most of the general public, was quite sympathetic with the students. So I think the media, in fact, failed to do what maybe was what they intended.
The police were roundly condemned for employing a crowd control tactic known as kettling, in which students were forcibly detained and corralled by gangs of armed officers.
The police response to the big student demonstrations was ridiculously over the top, where they closed off both ends of Whitehall during the demonstration and kept thousands of students in an open-air, effective prison for most of the day.
I think it is unlawful to detain people, and that's what's happening. The police are detaining people just as if they'd taken them to a police station and locked them in a cell. They are detaining people without charge, obviously thousands at a time, most of whom, the overwhelming majority of whom will have committed no crime, aren't even suspected by the police of committing a crime, and therefore are being illegally detained.
I mean, there was a particularly striking image on the second demonstration, where the first time we actually got kettled, where everybody was kettled inside, and they'd left a police van in the middle of the area where they knew they were going to kettle us. There was a lot of discussion about whether this was left there on purpose or not, and whether it was or not, I don't know, but the police surely have the ability to have removed it to prevent it being smashed up. And then also in that kettle, we were kettled inside, and then other people were kettled outside in another kettle, and then outside of that, all the parents were kettled. Parents had come down to help their children, bring them food, bring them clothes, because it was the middle of the winter, absolutely freezing, and you had 10-year-old, 12-year-old people, not expecting to be stuck there for 9 hours, very scared, very upset, and their parents came down to assist them, and then they got kettled as well. I mean, there's not a quicker way of, I think, of radicalising students and parents and people in general than locking up young children for 9 hours in the cold.
We protected Parliament, we did that, but quite clearly there's some dreadful incidents, some dreadful behaviour. My officers came under some terrible attacks. The unpredictability of, I was going to say demonstrators, but I'd rather describe them as thugs, meant that we're dealing with a very difficult situation.
I visited the demonstration, I was part of it, and I met many of the students coming out of what's called the kettle later on, and they were very traumatised and very stressed by the experience. The overreaction of the police actually created the tensions in the demonstration, but the idea that it was a huge violent demonstration is simply incorrect.
And so I think it's absolutely wrong for the police to cavalry charge a bunch of students that don't possess any arms or are not out there to intend to do violence.
Bus card.
Have you seen this?
Huh?
This one.
No?
The police are handing them out. Yeah. Here's my personal favourite. I'll show you. Will I be contained? Every protest, they have tried to kettle students, and it's a technique which is purposely used to flare up anger, to try and create conflict, and it's ridiculous. I think it's a disgusting tactic, and it should be outlawed. It shouldn't be allowed.
I really think tuition fees are wrong. I think it is wrong to saddle young people with 25,000 quid of debt before they've even taken a first step in adult life.
Student anger was levelled at the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, and his party's coalition with Tory Prime Minister David Cameron. The Liberal Democrats had done a U-turn on pre-election promises to end tuition fees.
I think that the plans that, as far as I can make out, both the Conservatives and Labour parties are cooking up in one way or another to raise the cap on tuition fees is wrong. We will resist, vote against, campaign against any lifting of that cap.
The students are really disappointed with what the Lib Dems have done, going back on their manifesto promises. I think it's really highlighted how parliamentary politics, in parliamentary politics, politicians can say whatever they like when they're not in power, and then when they're in power, they can go back on these.
This is an extraordinarily difficult issue, and I've been entirely open about the fact that we have not been able to deliver. We have not been able to deliver the policy that we held in opposition.
And the fact